A Greenville man will stay in prison. His appeal to have his murder conviction overturned was denied. Samuel Burnside was convicted of murder in 2020 and sentenced to 45 years in prison. He appealed the conviction, saying prosecutors used a jury strike in a, quote, racially discriminatory manner. Burnside requested that the court void the jury panel, which they denied. The State Court of Appeals ruled they were justified in denying him, saying he didn't meet the burden of proof that the state was discriminatory in the jury strike. So Burnside killed Catherine Clark. This was in 2017 near the intersection of Sagittarius Way and Stables Road. He and Clark had gotten into an argument in his car before he forced her out of that car and shot her 3 times and then left her body in the road. Burnside will be eligible for release in 2062.